Good evening. Folks are still joining us. So I missed you all the last couple of weeks. I was traveling for the Episcopal Church and then was on vacation last week, and grateful for Brother Andrew's leadership in my absence. Yes, I heard great things and not surprised by that. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the chapter on Sabbath. And again, realizing we're dealing with weather outside, so hope everybody stays safe as you are gathering and wherever you are. So one thing about tonight's conversation on Sabbath, after reading it and have really enjoyed this book, after reading it, I was aware that there's more things I wanted to say about Sabbath that I was hoping Carter might take on. So I want to say one word about how I understand Sabbath. I want to invite Brother Andrew to also give a little bit more, maybe add some additional ideas to the definition of what we have from this chapter before we go into our small groups. And grateful for what you'll add to this as well. I think in particular, this chapter is one that again reminds us of our connection to that very first chapter about silence. Because I think at some point, silence in the contemplative posture is definitely a place where you encounter that just core understanding of yourself as a child of God. And so I think at some point, Sabbath is about embracing that basic core identity of who you are as a created being. So I think in particular, this chapter is connected to the first chapter. I think the one thing I would want to say about Sabbath that I didn't quite kind of saw in some ways with this chapter from Carter, I think I just want to be more emphatic about this. I think when we think about the creation story and how we read the creation story historically in the life of the church, we think about each day of creation and sort of what God is creating each day as created beings. And I think particularly if we ever think about ourselves as humanity as somehow being the top of some pyramid in creation, that somehow on the sixth day we were created, so somehow we must be, God's favorite ones, or somehow the pinnacle of creation. I've heard, see if Jerry can find Mama. Go see Mama. Go find Mama. We trust he's going to find Mother. Go find Mama. Go find Mama. I think that sense in the creation story, for me, what I've often heard said by other much wiser speakers and teachers is this idea of on the seventh day, that the final thing that God created was rest. Think about the idea of Sabbath, or rest, being God's final sort of highest creation. And it's such an incredible creation that God, in God's own way, embraced this creation, that God, who was without, infinite and power and love and grace, even allowed God to rest. So God sort of set within God's own self some sort of limits of finitude within the midst of infinitude. And whenever I thought about the idea of Sabbath being God's last creation, for me, that's helped me think about the idea of embracing Sabbath. That as opposed to you and me being the height of creation, so it all depends on us, we become responsible. If we don't do it, who will do it? I think when I've thought about the idea of Sabbath and rest being the last piece of creation, becomes almost a really important, maybe a corrective on that thinking of it depends on you and me to do the work, as opposed to there's this last source of creation that is rest. And that last source of creation that is God's highest and best use. That's the one thing I wanted to add. I'm going to now invite Brother Andrew, while I kind of rescue an anxious puppy here in the corner, to add some additional wisdom. I'm going to mute myself while I care for a puppy.
All right, so in the heretics corner, no, okay. No, so this chapter, it was good. And there's some moments we're going to find later in the book where Richard Carter sort of adds and refines this, hones it sharper, because I think he was kind of getting there, but because it wasn't. So, exploring Sabbath theology, which is a theological study into all of us, we run into a lot of RE words, words that begin with RE, which implies, thanks to our dictionary minded friends in the world, again or again and again to indicate repetition, or back or backwards to indicate withdrawal or backward motion. And we see these in the words of the vow of the Sabbath community. They say, we commit to creating a place and space in our lives each week for rest, RE, and relaxation, replenishment, those sorts of things. So I actually have another spin on Bishop's understanding of Sabbath, in that we were talking this morning and he just told you that. But I almost wonder if Sabbath is not the origin point, the point from which God acted through creation. So what was before the act, the creative act, before the universe? They have actually been a moment of rest itself before chaos, right? Sabbath is that place where we can go with God to find ourselves afresh and ready for creation and the busyness of the world again and again, creation and creating over and over. There are so many inspirational words that can inform Sabbath, but I will spare you etymological nightmares and skip to the point. So my theology of of Sabbath are 4 R's. They are retreat, rest, reflect, and recreate. They're in that particular order, and I say recreate purposefully. So to retreat, the primary action of Sabbath is to retreat. It's a withdrawal from, a removal of the self from, an action that takes us away from demanding an obligatory labor and attention into a new space. Yes, this is primarily a weekly setting aside of one day for Sabbath. For me, that's Saturday. It's a day to be without. However, it's also seasonal and annual retreat in some longer form. And we need these moments for deeper soul searching, for a more penetrating gaze into ourselves. These are the retreats to monasteries and retreat centers. And there you can engage in the altogether different work of Sabbath. The second word, rest. Once we have retreated, we need to take time to recover from where we were, and in many cases, the journey to Sabbath. So in Richard Carter's chapter, he talks a lot about pilgrimage, and even in sections he doesn't call pilgrimage, they're actually about pilgrimage. To me, pilgrimage is the journey to Sabbath. True rest and Sabbath theology isn't just a nap, although it can be a nap. It isn't just sleep, but it can be sleep. It is a restorative action, a bringing of oneself back to the origin. It is bringing yourself back into a state of true being with, of true aware, mindful presence. In many cases, this is enveloped in silence. Try building a day with periodic silence and with silence before breakfast and after dinner. It's quite fascinating, especially when you're in a monastery with other people chewing crunchy cereal. The third word, reflect. As contemplative Christians, one of our primary calls is to be mindful of ourselves, of our journeys, of our interaction with others. We are called not only to be mindful in the present, but to take time to reflect. We've talked about the examine, our practice of taking time at the end of the day to look back on our day without harsh judgment, with the grace to help us be aware of ourselves. But with Sabbath, reflection can go deeper, especially on a long retreat. The practices of journaling and confession are particularly helpful in addition to our practice of silence. And lastly, recreation, which I am saying intentionally this way, as we often say recreation, loaded with a lot of physical and sports activity. Recreation is another outgrowth of our Sabbath. It is a creativity born of the restorative and reflective time of our Sabbath. It is also an expansive recreation as we recreate ourselves, refashioned and refreshed as renewed people, to then go back out into the world as contemplative persons in a busy world. There's the four fundamentals buzz down of Brother Andrew's Sabbath theology in a nutshell, as fast as I could make it.
So before we jump into the small group, I'm aware that Bob has given us a good chunk here. Bob, you want to just offer your bit of wisdom before we move to small group?
Yeah, I was just thinking, even taking it, Andrew, even a little further. And I say here, the note, it may just be because of where I am right now in my spiritual journey. But he doesn't really get into depth until the next chapter when he talks about being in the hospital. But I was shocked by the commonality of the way he described Sabbath and the silence it struck me as being very close to death. And being Lutheran, Luther's Small Catechism highlights that we're called to die every day and be raised again every day, and allow ourselves to do that every day. And I think there's no greater act of rest than die, to allow oneself just to let go, and then trust that we'll be raised to new life. There we go.
Which is the last RE word, resurrection.
Thank you.
Wink.
So, Brother Andrew, I'm seeing, thank you for that, Bob. I'm seeing, I think we have about 20 folk on the call. So you want to put us into groups of 4 and give us about 15 minutes to visit?
Hold just a second. Okay.
Oh, and before, so again, I think as you go into the small groups, think about both your responses, your reaction to Carter's chapter on Sabbath. Maybe also reflect on, for you, what is Sabbath? Both kind of what do you understand it to be, and what does that look like in your life? And that can be both what it does look like, maybe also some aspirational, what you'd like it to look like. So, I think so. Let's leave with a lot of grace here, both of kind of maybe what you experience and what you would hope, and to think about, and you might even want to, for the bonus round, are there ways in which the life of the church can help support you in the keeping of Sabbath? Okay, is that all clear? And grab your puppy or kitty or whoever needs a little extra support right now as we embrace these thunders. Brother Andrew, can you send us away for about 15 minutes?
All right. Bye.
We've ascended to a higher plane, apparently.
No one else is here.
The elect. Surely it's
Their elect. I don't know.
if God finds 3 faithful people, God will spare the city. So the city is spared. See if I can ask Brother Andrew. It's what's
typically we haven't had to push that blue button, so this is kind of cool because I did it and it worked and then it didn't work.
Let me ask Brother Anderson. I see Vonnie, I see Mark. Let's see.
They're trying to exclude us, Brian.
So I see Brother Andrew. Hey,
It should be moving everyone back soon.
so we saw blue buttons and hit blue buttons to leave the room, and not the
Yeah,
middle.
this is where in our room I was saying there's only so far that I control the magic. So like I tried to close them and it was like, oh, in 60 seconds we'll do it automatically. But then all of a sudden it's like, oh, you get another 60 seconds, and this is where I just can't control the magic.
Okay. Well, I see people.
Oh, good.
I'm seeing more people.
Hopefully living people. If you start seeing a lot of dead people, then
No,
you might be in a movie.
I'm seeing more people. Up with people. The best kind of people to know. More people were for people. Okay. Oh my gosh, here they come. Wow. A potpourri of people. Okay. We are back. Brother Andrew, thank you for doing your magic on small groups, and small groups, thank you for both regrouping with us. So what sort of wisdom did you hear in the room about your responses to Carter, or your own sense of Sabbath keeping, the idea of Sabbath? What would you want us to know from your small groups? If you'll either raise the hand through the raise the hand feature or unmute yourself, what would you want us to know? Kitty?
It's unique to each person.
Yeah.
It feeds a different need in each person, and how important it is to just accept that, not make it look like the Sundays some of us grew up with, where you didn't do anything on the Sabbath.
Right, right. Yeah, my memory of the Sabbath keeping and growing up in Southeast Missouri is we'd go to my grandparents in Arkansas, have lunch, and then sit around the living room and look at each other, right? We'd stare at each other for an hour and a half. And my grandfather would occasionally just sort of express air, just sort of say something, kind of, well, and just like, I mean, it was like an hour and a half of just like adults looking at each other. And that was Sabbath keeping. And
So it was Quaker worship.
it was, Quaker worship done by Southern Baptists. So it was quite a fascinating cross-cultural experience. So yeah, because when I hear visiting in Mississippi, that's right. We'd go visit my grandparents. You go visit with people. I love that. And yeah, because when I hear Bob Miller say, "Oh, my idea of Sabbath is riding a motorcycle," yeah, it's not my idea of Sabbath, but Bob has found his, right? So yeah, so there's a unique nature to what does it mean for us to find rest. What are other things you'd want to say from your small groups? What wisdom did you hear, either that you brought or others expressed?
I'll speak for room 3. We were all women, and there were a few things that were brought out, elevated in our time together, which were women in Sabbath are often doing this sort of contemplative tasks, because that was the time that was allowed for women to be in silence while you're doing the dishes, while you're making lunch, while you're doing the cleaning up, perhaps. Even in places of retreat, women had to be separated from the monks and were not allowed to participate in Sabbath. So women found other ways to do that. So we called that women in Sabbath. Also, the importance of community. I had a profound experience living a year with an Israeli family, and the sense of everyone participating, sharing, doing ritual, asking questions. And that was also very important to a lot of the women in our group, was the importance of ritual and how that grounds us and gives us moments of Sabbath.
And thank you for that good wisdom and good insight. Mark Downing, sitting Shiva with living. Expound on that.
When the Quakers sat quietly, or your Southeast Missouri folks did, and looked at each other and said nothing, that's what it reminded me of.
Mm.
It's very powerful that way, unless you have to get up and go to the bathroom, which kind of breaks the silence. But in an ancient meeting house where I'm from, they didn't do that very much, because whoever the presiding priest was sat in the pulpit and orated for hours. And it wasn't Baptist at all, it was Universalist.
Mm. Wow.
I found that a very fascinating comment, to sit and look at each other. Kind of reminded me of that.
Yeah, thank you. Other wisdom that you want to offer to the large group that you encountered in the small group?
This was an easy chapter for me to relate back to the chapter on silence, I think. Because there was a lot of good reminders in the chapter about how Sabbath, kind of like contemplative prayer, is not something that we do, that we succeed at, that we're trying to measure. It's kind of the opposite of that. And has this brief kind of description of Sabbath as presence that really resonated, that kind of presence is only really possible when you're not trying to accomplish something. You're just being present with the one who loves you, and the one who loves you is present with you.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Other wisdom and insight?
I felt like in our group, we had a discussion about, with different stages in life and the difficulty in finding space for Sabbath, and particularly touching on what I've forgotten her name now said. Women in particular. I mean, I find that the days, like, let's say if you talk about Sunday, I mean, for me after church, that's, I've got to go to the grocery and I've got to get the laundry done. I've got to do this. And so finding moments, it's easier now that my children are somewhat older. I mean, my youngest is 11. So at school all day. So my house is quiet and I can find some quiet time, but I don't do that for Sabbath. So it would have to be something that I'd have to work at, to tell you the truth.
Thank you for that, Jennifer. I think I'm aware, and I've heard it said, that so much of the Exodus, the book of Exodus in Hebrew scripture, in some ways has to do with sort of, the slaves not being able to sort of keep Sabbath, right? That there's almost like there's a huge justice issue involved in sort of God saying, people who aren't free can't truly be all they're intended to be, because the part of who they're intended to be is to be free to worship, right? Free to embrace who they are as a child of God. If they've been turned into, you have to create bricks without straw, then you've lost the aspect of who you are. And I think it's also a sense, I mean, I always feel this if I'm on retreat somewhere, that not only becomes some sort of luxury that I get to do, as opposed to what degree does everyone deserve the space in the day, the space in the week, the space in the year to have that? So to what degree do we think about Sabbath keeping as sort of a justice issue, right? Because otherwise it just becomes like, I get to go to the spa, you don't get to go to the spa, as opposed to we really all are deserving of this sort of understanding of ourselves.
Amber,
Add to that just a bit. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Virginia in our group, I hope I remembered your name correctly, also said the same thing you're saying, Bishop Cole, where so often women in Sabbath are doing the preparation or making it possible for others in a family or community. And when, as the last speaker said, when those roles are sort of gone and you find that you are just with a loved one or by yourself, it's really hard to know how to give yourself permission and learn to have that space. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
In our group, Amber, if I can repeat what you said, was the book Rest is Resistance, which relates to what you just said, Bishop, which is part of the NAP ministry, which is where a lot of some of my Sabbath theology comes from, is the NAP ministry. So that's definitely on point with that. It's actually a justice issue, especially for like Black bodies at rest is one of the big ones, or persons of color at rest is a really big issue.
Yeah.
One of the things in our group, I've lost my video somehow, but one of the things in our group we also talked about is being somewhat intentional and recognizing it and even if you have a busy work schedule or a busy life, family schedule, is try to find those moments when you can take advantage of some. Again, I think someone said earlier, it's very akin to the first chapter about silence. Being able to find that silence and that quiet time to experience some Sabbath.
Thank you. That's Don, right? Thank you,
Yeah.
Don. Anything that was said in the small group that's not been offered here yet that you want to offer? Without putting anyone on the spot, but wanting.
Anne has raised her hand.
Anne? Okay.
Hawkins. Yes.
The other Ann in our group, Ann Michael, said something. Well, two things. One was, which we didn't do, but to talk about something that showed up in our readings, like a favorite passage and something that really spoke to us. So there was a desire to perhaps do that at some point, or we could have done it at that moment. And what the justice conversation brings to mind something. I one time sat on an airplane with someone who was an estate manager for a very wealthy family in New York. And she explained that she was there, she always had to be there on, Shabbat, so Friday evening through Saturday, because if there were decisions that needed to be made, she was going to be that person. She stood instead of them. And I thought then, as you guys were talking, can we do that? I worked for a consulting firm where we had like a duty consultant, and it was, if you were traveling, this person took your calls for you. And I'm wondering if we can do that with intentionality. Ask someone, like, I need 2 hours, or I want 2 hours because I want to go get a pedicure, or whatever that is. Because for me, that might be Sabbath. It might not be to somebody else. Asking for help, or help from the community, whatever that means for us, something that occurred to me.
Well, and that's a really good insight, because both, I think, if you can ask for help and the community can help support you in that. I know I've had great experiences of that happening. When I was a younger person, I was in a toxic work environment where if you took vacation, you sort of paid for it, right? Because you came back and the landscape of the office had shifted. And so like you couldn't take the break, or you would lose ground. As opposed to, I think, when we're in good, healthy environments and you're away, people protect you being away, people support you being away. People don't, we'll just dump this on Dan's desk, or we'll, throw Ann under the bus. And so I think the ways in which we protect each other's Sabbath keeping, or we undercut it, right? Yeah. And so I think, again, that's a part of how we truly make this not just my individualness, but my sense of belonging to a community. I either support people in their Sabbath keeping, or I really, or in some ways almost punish them, right, if they try to seek rest. So,
And I think it's all part of that work-life balance that generations younger than I am have talked about for several years. It's moving away from, work is life. It's giving yourself a chance. Like, I won't respond to emails, or whatever it is, whatever it might mean for us.
very much so. Anything we've not said that we want to say to each other before we practice some silence as a way of Sabbath keeping?
I would like to read this short sentence. I'm sorry, paragraph.
Yeah.
It's from the introduction. This is Amber. It's from the introduction of Rest is Resistance.
Okay.
I wish you rest today. I wish you a deep knowing that exhaustion is not a normal way of living. You are enough. You can rest. You must resist anything that doesn't center your divinity as a human being.
You are worthy of care. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber. And for those of us who don't know the book, Rest is Resistance, that is written by whom?
Trisha Hersey.
Okay, awesome. Amber, thank you for that. Is there other wisdom we want to share with each other before we move into a few minutes of silence as a way of putting a capstone on tonight? Okay. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being here tonight. Next week is Staying With. So hope you'll return and be with us next week at 7. I would invite us to do, I'll set a clock for 5 minutes for some quiet prayer as a way of capstoning all this good conversation and wisdom tonight. Thank you for showing up for each other and the wisdom that you've offered and the wisdom you received from each other. You're a gift to me and to each other. And hope you and your pets are now in safe post-storm environments. So let us pray for 5 minutes and then I'll call us out. Keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night, and give your angels charge over those who sleep. Tend the sick, Lord Christ. Give rest to the weary. Bless the dying. Soothe the suffering. Pity the afflicted. Shield the joyous. And all for your love's sake. Amen. Blessings on the rest of your evening and your rest, and blessings on the day ahead. See you next week, if not before.